Welcome to the fifth in our Technology Empowered Conservation Seminar Series. You remember that last week we had a really great lecture by Adam Formica on agent-based modelling. This week we're going to be doing something a little bit different again, and we're going to be introducing some work which we've been doing this in this department and with colleagues Richard Ladle, who's here in Brazil, called Conservation Culturomics. I'll give a sort of introductory scoping to the idea of conservation culturomics, and then we're really glad to have Professor Richard Ladle from the University of Alagoas online from the beach, well, nearly the beach in Maceió in Brazil. So welcome, Rich. Thanks very
much.
Yeah, good. I hope all of this is going to work. Just to say for a bit of background, many of you may know Rich Ladle, some of you will. Rich Ladle was the first course director of the Biodiversity Conservation and Management MSc. So Rich, it's great to have you on the 15th anniversary of the course. Rich and I have done a lot of work together over the years in various areas. And the work we're going to present today, it's sort of coming together on conservation culturomics. Another key person in this is John Mittenmeier, who's doing his PhD, and will do part of the talk. And then another person who might be with Rich is Ricardo Correa, who's done a lot of the work on the on sort of cracking the methods and thinking of the applications of them. Rich might have just gone to bring him over. Who knows on that? What were you doing there? Sorry, you're trying to find him. Anyhow.
Yeah,
okay. So let me just start by introducing the concept of conservation culturomics and how we got into this. It was quite a long, 2008 I think, Rich had this idea about extinction and needing a biocultural theory of extinction. We started thinking a lot then about this reality, if you like, that some species have got greater presence in culture than other species. I think we all know this, that we know that there's a set of iconic species, but then when you ask people to say, what are all the cultural species, it sort of tails off or whatever. So we know that species or sites, natural places, natural entities, play a role in culture. And they occupy places either in human narratives, the frames, the practices, the things we do, the sort of things which create this intersubjective reality in which we live as humans, our collective life. And that both govern collective life and give meaning to collective life. So I think we can all get this idea. I mean, you imagine the concept of courage without a lion, or you imagine the sense of the American nation without those fantastic national parks of Yosemite and Yellowstone or something. Or maybe much more recent, we imagine as environmentalists the oil palm issue without the orangutan being in there. So this idea that species hold a place in culture, some species do, but not all. Also, we know that this cultural presence, what we in culturomics call saliency, the relative presence of species or natural entities in culture, that they're material to conservation policy. They may manifest in terms of reputational or financial or political risk. We've got some feedback there, haven't we? I'll come over here a bit, that may be better. Associated with development projects. A classic example of this was about 3 years ago when an oil company called Socco got concessions to mine in Virunga National Park. Everybody had forgotten what Virunga National Park was or where it was, but the fact that there was gorillas in this park meant that there was a huge campaign against them, and actually they pulled out of that concession. So that capital, that investment in it, was a sunk cost. So in that case, we know that these species have a material risk. A material to conservation policy. They're also material in many other ways, just fundraising, publicity, getting people excited about nature. If we ever sort of surveyed the set of species which are on the Attenborough films, we'll probably find that there's a classic set of species there. They're also an asset for nature-based economies. If we want to, or when people are promoting economies, they're marketing the big cultural species, you know, the big five of Africa, or increasingly now Rewilding Europe is marketing a big five of Europe there. Something else that maybe we haven't brought into sight yet is that they might be also material for the accountability of the conservation movement, of conservation NGOs, of our practice. So for example, when the God, I've forgotten the name of the dolphin in China went extinct, there was a bit of a hoo-ha, but not really. If something like rhino went extinct, a lot of the public might quite rightly turn around and say, hang on, WWF, what have you been doing? I thought that's what your job was. So they may hold a material risk for the conservation movement. But also they tend to shape conservation as well as a collective ideal. So this was a line of our thinking, realising that not only are there cultural species, but actually species with a cultural presence also are material to policy. However, this component hasn't really been, or it's been downplayed in the science of policy, the science of conservation and the policy of conservation. I think there's a number of reasons that, if we look back at history a little bit, this idea of conserving species or sites because they were beautiful and wonderful and we think they're fantastic was seen as a bit sentimental in the post-World War II world. It wasn't seen as being suited to the new rational science which was going to guide policy from there on. I think also that whole concept of culture and species, or culture and species together, just seemed altogether too complex, too contextual and located, and therefore just not something which science could really deal with. It was sort of, we don't quite do that as ecologists or conservation scientists. But crucially, there was no way to systematically measure or quantify or compare or index the relative cultural presence of species. We couldn't do it at scale. We could do a local social survey and get a sense of that, but there was no way to do this at scale. And that's what's changed. So the internet, as this messy unstructured social survey, has actually changed that. Potentially, and this is what we've been working at, from internet matrix we can generate metrics of culturalness. So this is the logic, is that the cultural presence or profile of the species is a relational trait. So it's something which attaches to the species. You know, a panda looks cute, and that in relation to our sense of liking animals which are cute creates a relational trait. That relational trait may be this word sedimented. So it may be so sedimented in culture that it's slightly got delinked from the species itself. You know, the idea of the wolf within us, or waterfalls, they're just sedimented in the history of human culture. Other times that relational trait may appear when there's a discovery, like the great apes in the 1860s, and then become very embedded in culture. Or it may just pop up in certain bits of culture. An example of this was the cute slow loris videos which went viral on YouTube 2 or 3, well, maybe more than that, 4 or 5 years ago. So then the logic goes, okay, so we know that some of these species have this cultural presence, and cultural presence, we can think of that as manifesting in terms of citizens either posting photos or writing to the internet or searching for things on the internet. So if a species has cultural presence, the idea is that that will translate or manifest in some sort of practice with which we interact with the internet, and that we can measure, and that we can index. So the frequency of those practices, writing a website with a species name in, or a national park name in, or searching for particular species, that is what we can start getting a handle on. And that we can quantify and compare the frequency of those practices of that interaction with the internet. And given the increasing global reach of the internet, maybe that's a pretty decent proxy for culture at the moment. So we can sort of go to scale, if you like. So that's the logic of this. And we sort of published that a couple of years ago in a paper, and started also trying to talk about the range of potential applications for this. So, you know, maybe if we had this new metric, this new data to go into the mix, it might help maintain and mobilise public interest. It could be used to identify new conservation emblems. If you've got one species which is iconic, it might be we can find the characteristics of that and identify underutilised iconic species, or, you know, flagships which haven't been used yet. We could use this to analyse and monitor the cultural impacts of conservation success and failures, maybe, or extend the value and impact of key conservation knowledge products such as red lists. Rich is going to talk about this a little bit, but this idea that red lists are a measure of extinction risk, that if a species is highly cultural, people, the conservation movement is more likely to mobilise to save it, therefore it's at less extinction risk. So that measure could either amplify or reduce the red list index. I talked about creating reputational risk tools. It might also help us to just revisit some key assumptions and categories and the way we think about how we've institutionalised science in conservation policy. And then maybe this is a big open, is this question, well, if we have these metrics, how else might other people use them? What might they be used for? So that's where I'm going to finish, just to give you that sort of broad overview of some of the logics where we're coming from, and hopefully you'll ask us about these or interrogate us on these towards the end. But Rich, this is the point now where I pass over to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back in Oxford, virtually back in Oxford again. Right, so Paul's already introduced a little bit about the idea of conservation culturomics, and I want to go a little bit deeper into the theory and concepts underlying culturomics and how we can apply this to a specific case study of the metrics of cultural value of species. So, first of all, what is the definition, the formal definition of culturomics? According to the Mitchell paper, the study, culturomics is the study of human culture through the analysis of word frequency dynamics in large bodies of texts, these texts being termed corpora. Now, conservation culturomics obviously is a sub field within culturomics, and we've defined this as the study of human interactions with nature and efforts to preserve it through the analysis of word frequency dynamics in digital corpora. These could be any sort of digital corpora. It could be websites, it could be social media corpora, it could be digital photograph corpora, with the idea that digital photographs can be converted into text and you can analyse the text through culturomics. So this seems, on face value, this seems a very simple thing to do. You go into the internet, you extract information from digital corpora about the frequency with which certain words that you're interested in occur, and then you analyse this in relation to other factors, social or biological. However, it's as with all these things, it's a little bit more complicated than that. This is the general workflow. I don't want to talk very long about this, but in essence you need to choose the digital corpora that is most appropriate to the question that you're trying to answer. You then design automatic scrapes that work with the API. These APIs often have restrictions with them, capture your data. It's big data, so you spend a lot of time cleaning and ordering and understanding the biases of the data. You then need to curate the data, interpret what the data actually means, and this really is quite problematic because you have to identify, you have to create models to explain the cultural changes that you're witnessing, or the cultural trends you're witnessing. And then, of course, you're trying to develop useful metrics that we can go out and use for practical conservation purposes. So, what I want to talk you through today is perhaps one of the easiest types of conservation culturomics metrics and applications to conceptualize. This is why are some species more represented on the internet than others? And what does this mean for conservation? So, some species clearly, as Paul started off saying, are more culturally visible than other species. This is reflected by their representation on the internet. So we can theoretically create metrics of public interest and public visibility in species. So, I think a good way to think about this is to think about three different realms of existence for a species. You have the physical realm, where the actual animal or plant exists as individuals or species or populations. When people think about a tiger, so if you close your eyes and think about a tiger, you can picture a tiger in your head. This is a mental representation. So tigers also exist in the mental realm. So everybody who knows what a tiger is has a mental model of a tiger. And that mental model could be influenced by physical encounters with it, but more often than not, it's influenced by representation, with encounters with representations of tigers. I've seen tigers in the zoo, but I've seen a lot more tigers on television or in books. So this representational realm is the realm of, also the realm of digital representation. So this is where Culturomics comes along, where we can investigate the biogeography of species within the representational realm. And of course this also affects our mental models of species. Now, there's been some very interesting trends going on with respect to encounters in the representational and the physical realms. First of all, encounters in the physical realm are decreasing. This is something that scientists have been calling the extinction of experience. More and more people, especially children, have less and less contact with nature. And the consequence of this is a dissociation with the natural world, and potentially affecting our environmental attitudes and behaviour with serious consequences to conservation. This is an example from Japan. This is from 1998 and 2009. So within a decade, you're finding a decrease in, an increase in the percentage of children that don't have experience of things like mountaineering, climbing, fishing, catching insects, bird watching. These are practices of engagement with nature, and practices of engagement are incredibly important to help us form our mental models of species and nature, which influence our attitudes and behaviour. At the same time, the opportunities for encounters with nature in the representational realm have been increasing, and they've been increasing since prehistoric times. There was a time that the only representations that we had in prehistory were basic art and a lot of storytelling. This started to change 5,000 years ago with the invention of writing. And then we had a huge increase in dissemination of information with the creation of the printing press in the 1400s. And then things really started to take off in Victorian times, where we had the development of photography, radio, films, going into the early 1900s, television, and then of course we had the information revolution commencing with the creation of the World Wide Web in 1990. And then we have all of these new platforms for the dissemination of information: Google, Facebook, Twitter. By 2012, there were over 1 billion people with smartphones, with almost 24/7 access to information on the internet. To put this into context, there's approximately 3.8 billion people with access to the internet. Almost 50% of everybody that lives in the world. 2.8 billion social media users. 4.9 billion unique mobile users. And 2.5 billion active mobile social users. So the penetrance globally of the internet is enormous. Now this is important for us, obviously, because we're interested in explaining the public visibility, the digital visibility of species and natural features. And it's important for the effect on conservation if a lot of people have access to this information and are using it and are engaging with it in the representational realm. Okay, so what? Physical encounters with species are decreasing. digital encounters with species are increasing. Well, what we're going to see, of course, if this trend continues, and there's no reason to think that it's not going to continue, is that encounters with nature in the representational realm, especially digital platforms, are going to increasingly shape our mental models of species and natural places. And these mental models have the power to influence our knowledge, attitudes and behaviour towards nature and nature conservation. Therefore, we should be, as academics, we should be trying to understand what drives the digital representation of nature and what the consequences of this are going to be for conservation. And this is where conservation culturomics comes in. In terms of drivers of species representation in the representational realm, in the digital realm, this is a kind of biogeography. You can think of species as actually inhabiting the representational realm and the digital realm. And the digital realm has a geography and it has time. So we're trying to explain the distribution of species in the digital realm over time and space, biogeography, or by the internet biogeography, or biogeography as we call it. There are two principles here. The first one is that the frequency and quality of encounters with species in the real world will positively influence representation in the digital world. So frequency would include factors such as range, abundance, conspicuousness, whether they're easy to see, whether they live in anthropogenic habitats, whether there's a high captive population, so whether you can see them in zoos, farms. The quality of encounters relates strongly to practices of engagement. Obviously, passing a blackbird on your way to work is a bit different from somebody who's actively hunting a blackbird. Not that you're allowed to do that. Aesthetics. Beautiful creatures, obviously, are going to provide a different quality of experience. Conservation interest. Seeing a rare or endangered species provides a different quality of experience. Dangerousness. I had invasion of tarantulas last week in my house. That certainly left an impression on me. It was a certain quality of experience. And cultural embeddedness. Species that we know about, that we've heard lots of stories about, that we have a strong mental model of. This is going to be the sort of species that when we encounter them is going to leave a lasting impression. The second principle of biogeography is that the frequency and quality of encounters with species in the digital world, the representational realm, will positively influence representation in the same realm, in the digital realm. So, what influences salience? What influences the frequency of encounters in the digital realm? Well, part of it is how frequent they are in the digital realm. We refer to this as salience, often web salience or internet salience. Depends on internet geography. Obviously, if you've got a huge number of internet users like we have in Western Europe or the United States, then you have to be on the internet in order to encounter a representation of a species or a place. The web platform, web pages, blogs, social media is going to influence the frequency of encounters, what you use, and digital visibility. For example, when you're searching, some web pages are prioritized over others. So it may be that there are some species or places that you're more likely to encounter because of the built-in biases in the internet. So, let's get down to brass tacks. How did we do this? Well, first of all, we had to generate metrics of species salience on the internet. However, there's a big problem. Lots of languages in the world, and if you use common names are used for other things as well. The great example is teal, which is also a paint. If you type teal into Google, you're going to get millions of web pages about paint of no interest to us at all. So our idea was, well, perhaps we can use Latin names as a proxy of common names. The idea being that a proportion of all websites that mention the species will also mention the Latin name. And this is all bird species in the world, And you can see there's a very strong correlation between the salience of scientific names and the salience of vernacular names. And these outliers here are where you have particular factors such as taxonomic revisions means that obviously the scientific name, the new scientific name has very low salience. These ones, vernacular homonymous species, are where you have vernacular names which have other meanings such as teal. And occasionally you have scientific names that also have these characteristics. So, does this relationship hold for different languages and cultures? Really important if we're going to do a global analysis. The answer is yes. The relationship is almost exactly the same. You can see there's an effect of number of web pages here. But the more web pages you have, such as in Australia or the USA, the better the relationship. We appear to have a different slope on this relationship here, but this was our fault. We only did the analysis in Catalan, stupidly forgetting that there is, in Castilian, stupidly forgetting that there is also Catalan and Basque within Spain. So if you were to add these vernacular languages, the slope would adjust to the normal slope. Okay. So we've done a couple of studies about what drives digital representation. This was our first attempt at it. This was before we developed the full model for representation. And what we did is we looked at 4 taxa of Brazilian birds: toucans, hummingbirds, parrots, and woodpeckers. And we looked at Brazilian salience on Brazilian websites and international websites, and tested for the influence of frequency of encounters in the physical realm, range, size, human population within species range, occurrence in anthropogenic environments. We had one measure of quality of encounters, which is body size, which relates to aesthetic, but it also relates to, obviously, to frequency of encounters, because it's related to conspicuousness. And conservation interest, endemism, endangerment. Our best model showed that for Brazil, familiarity was the biggest driver, especially human population size or species range. So the more encounters in the physical realm, the more salience in the digital realm. International websites, as you might have predicted, it was body size. Big birds tended to be overrepresented. Big Brazilian birds were overrepresented. So here are some of our best known Brazilian birds. If we look at this for a global model, and we've recently done this, we looked at all extant bird species, scientific names plus synonyms, and we tested for the influence of geographic range, internet penetrance, frequency of interactions on the internet, conservation interest, quality of experience, aesthetics, body size again, practices of engagement, which we feel were likely to be very important about influencing quality of experience, whether they're hunted or whether birds are kept, conspicuousness, whether they're nocturnal, large body size, and cultural embeddedness. How long have these things been known to science? The idea being that the older things have been known, the things known to science originally were the things already well known to culture. And the results are remarkable in many respects. We found very strong relationships with practices of engagement in the physical realm, bird keeping, hunting. We found strong relationships with frequency of encounters. There's a strong relationship with birds that you find in urban habitats. Populations that are increasing, and these are likely to be birds that can exploit urban habitats, so there's some overlap here in causality, also had high salience. Web capacity, calculated as the percentage of global web users within countries where the species occur, and you can see very widespread birds with a that occur in high internet usage countries tend to have high internet salience. So this is adjusting for internet geographies. And we also found a very strong pattern, although it's not a linear pattern, it's actually a broken stick model here, where we found that the older birds those who have been known for science for a very long time, nearly all had very high salience. And then as science started to catalogue these more obscure species, they never became culturally salient in a way that the older, well-known, culturally embedded species were. To use this information as a metric, it's important to spatialize it. So you can do this by converting web salience into an index and then overlaying the index for each species onto a map to create a hotspot of cultural interest. These are the first ever maps of culturalness of species. This is for Brazilian birds for Brazilian websites, and we can see the pattern of familiarity. This is the giant population centres of Brazil in the southeast, in Sao Paulo, Rio, Minas Gerais. International websites, we found hotspots here in the Pantanal, where we have a lot of iconic species. Cold spots here in the Amazon that has a huge diversity, but very few globally iconic species. You can also do this globally. Here's another type of metric. So this is the question, where are the most digitally salient endangered bird species in the world? This is the map of all globally endangered species, and this is the map of publicly visible globally endangered species. So this is the 5% most digitally salient globally endangered bird species. And there are hotspots for them here in Central Asia and the African Rift Valley, and cold spots here in South and North America, which is also interesting because, of course, these are a type of umbrella species. Thank you very much.
All right, so my name's John Mittenmeier. I'm a DPhil student. I'm working with Paul and Rich Grenier, and I'm just going to sort of build on what Paul was saying and talk a little bit about some of the things I've been playing around with, particularly with one online corpus, Wikipedia. And I'll start out with kind of the thing that got me here was that, like, how did I end up working with Wikipedia? I'm coming from a field biology sort of background, and my main interest is species conservation. So this is really my kind of core interest in what I'm after. And one of the things for anyone, I imagine everyone in this room who's kind of thinking about species and species conservation, one of the most obvious features of that is exactly what Paul was talking about earlier, but species differ vastly in their culturalness and how much we know about them and how popular they are and how much we care about them, however you want to define and measure that aspect of human interest and attention. So I imagine everybody in the room will know this species. It's not quite a Madagascar fusa, but this one's probably, does anybody know what that is? I'm a bird watcher and I wouldn't have known either. It's a miller bird. But basically our interest does not correspond necessarily with conservation need, right? So this is a big challenge for many aspects of conservation. The things that need the most attention are not necessarily the things that we're most interested in saving, right? So this is exactly the question that Paul introduced earlier, and kind of what I'm interested in trying to get at is how can we compare these differences in popularity, these differences in interest at really large scales, and how can we do this in a way that's systematic and data-driven, rather than just kind of ad hoc approach of saying, what are the charismatic megafauna, what are the most popular species, because that starts out quite easily. We can say panda, tiger, lion, but then once you start to get into the details, how does the miller bird compare to the Seychelles magpie robin, or how do those two compare to an oriental magpie robin? It gets a lot more challenging, right? And so the corpus, the database I kind of stumbled upon and ended up getting interested in to do this is Wikipedia. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Wikipedia. It's an open access online encyclopedia that's user-generated, so people can freely contribute to it. And it's got a couple of features that make it really appealing for this kind of work. So both of these numbers are actually out of date now because I put them up 6 months ago, but Wikipedia is almost 300 language editions and it gets billions of views per month, right? So it's a huge database. It's multilingual, it gets a lot of interest and a lot of attention, and a huge thing is that it's structured. So it's structured in a way that every entity in Wikipedia is identified, and those entities are tagged across languages. So if someone clicks on the page for miller bird, in Wikipedia, we know that they're actually looking at the page for the bird rather than something else. Millibird's a bad example, but let's say jaguar. Someone clicks on the page for jaguar in Wikipedia, they're looking at the big cat, they're not thinking about cars, right? And they might have gotten there from the car, but by the time they get to the page, we know that they're actually looking at an animal rather than having to deal with these synonyms, right? I think Rich was just sort of getting into it, but it's a really sort of obvious feature of once you start digging into these culturomic type studies and these analyses is that they are a lot harder than you expect. And so I sort of looked at this and like, okay, I'll get a bunch of species in Wikipedia and we'll compare them and we'll go from there. It'll be quite easy. It's challenging. And one of the obvious challenges and the things to really think about are these skews in representation. So obviously there's a geography of the internet. Some places have internet access, other places don't. Quite conspicuously indigenous people who are huge stakeholders in many conservation actions and activities are not going to be looking at Wikipedia to the same extent that people in London or New York or Berlin will be, right? This is quite obvious in just how Wikipedia itself is structured, and that has a huge English bias. It's biased towards big European languages. So 90% of all Wikipedia views are in 10 languages, most of which are European. But still, I think there's a lot we can do with this, right? So a quick rundown of what I did trying to get at this was I started with existing taxonomies. So I had a global list of reptile distributions and an IOC, one of the world's taxonomies for birds. And a nice thing sort of talking about how these Wikipedia is structured is you can match an existing taxonomy onto entities in Wikipedia so that you can then link your biological attributes to whatever Wikipedia metric you're going to get. So you know, for example, the body size of one species, and you can correlate that with some sort of measure that you're going to get out of Wikipedia. All right, so this is a quick summary of what we did. Basically, you can use a combination of R and Python to match these taxonomies and then extract different aspects of metadata from Wikipedia. And there are a couple things I'll just give you a quick little overview here, a couple things I want you to notice. In that, first of all, you get a lot of species. Wikipedia's coverage for biodiversity is really impressive. It's uploaded things from various different taxonomic databases, integrated them into Wikipedia, and so you have almost comprehensive species list for many taxonomic groups. This is reptiles. We had 98% of the reptiles in the GUARD database where I had Wikipedia pages. Birds were up to 99.5, and that 0.5% is probably due to just taxonomic disagreement and sort of different taxonomies. Anybody who does a lot with taxonomy will know that taxonomists tend to be very particular about their lists. They'll often disagree. Next is there's a lot of views. So we can get really good coverage of species, and then we can get a big data set. So this is 1 year. Wikipedia is continuing to grow. So actually I expanded the birds to 2018, and I'm now up to about 500 million views. So you can get a lot of information. If you think of a page view as a single interaction, we're capturing a lot of them. And a lot of pages. So 212 pages for birds, 10,000 species. We're looking at about 20 language editions per bird species, right? All right, so I'll just briefly mention something with the reptiles, and then I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that are coming out of the bird data. So the first thing to look at with the reptiles is you said, what correlates with high page views? What are the attributes? What makes a reptile popular in Wikipedia? Any guesses? Anyone want to hazard a guess what the most popular reptile is in Wikipedia? Yes, Ina. What's that? Komodo dragon. Exactly. That is the #1 most viewed reptile in Wikipedia by a large margin. I was blown away. I did not expect that. So essentially, the quick summary is it's not too surprising, but these are the three of the most viewed species. If you're big, if you're dangerous to people, and if you look like a dragon, you end up being a popular reptile, right? So if you want to read more about that, we have a little bit of our results in this paper. We have our results in this paper. Okay. So next, I'll just tell you a little bit about the bird data. And basically, I think one of the big challenges here is you can kind of intuitively say, all right, we have a list of birds. We can extract all this Wikipedia metadata about them. We can build rankings and say sort of which species is getting the most edits, which species is getting the most views. But at the end of the day, what is this really telling us, and how is this useful for conservation? So as I've started to explore, I don't have all the answers, and I'd love to get some feedback on it, but as I've started to explore it, I think there are a couple things that are coming out of it that seem quite interesting and relevant to me. So I'll mention 4 of those right now. So the first big trend, the pattern you get, is that superstars dominate. The data is hugely skewed. So this is the summing views across all languages. This is the top 10 most viewed bird species. And this is 10% of all page views. So 10 birds get 10% of all page views. So it's 0.01%. 0.01% turning into 10%.
We'll bring him, come on.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. We're going multi-continent again.
No.
Video?
Oh yeah, thank you. It's exciting, this, isn't it? You've got to say.
Now it's on hold. No, it's on hold.
No worries.
Okay, carry on, John.
All right. Should we? Well, all right, I'll keep going. All right, so there's a huge skew in page views, right? If we expand that from, just the top 10 species to look at the top 1%, this is 1% of birds, it's about 40% of page views. 1% of reptiles is over 50%, right? So if we think about this, and it's kind of what are the conservation implications of this? If a lot of what motivates people to conserve species is cultural interest, some sort of value for that species.
I'm worried what he's going to say next.
So if a lot of what's motivating conservation is some sort of cultural value, cultural interest, then one of the outcomes of this is actually that's not going to work for a large majority of species, right? It sort of seems that for a small number of species, this might be a great. What's he going to say? For a small number of species, these cultural justifications could work really well, but for a large majority, it won't, right? This is something that's kind of intuitively obvious, but here's a quantitative demonstration of it.
I just wanted to say none of the messages is sending.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry that because it keeps interrupting and I don't know.
All right, I'll go back.
All right.
Should we
Should I just finish up?
No, don't, John, because it's good.
Well, no, just leave it.
Leave
Yeah.
this and focus on John. Maybe I should turn this off for a moment. Or maybe I should run and get... I'll tell you what, you keep going, John. I'm going to go to my office and speak to him over my... I'll get my iPad and do it that way. I don't need to keep going.
Can you turn off?
Can we
Sorry,
close
just get
it?
Can we turn off?
Oh yeah, the ship can connect, that's the way to do it. So if I go to lecture. Oh, no. Right.
Where are the lights?
Concentrate on John now, he's telling a good story here.
All right, I won't touch anything. I'm scared. I thought it was a bit optimistic trying to run Skype at the same time, but it worked really well for a while. All right. Okay, so there's a huge skew. Superstars dominate. There's a small number of species that attract the majority of the attention. The next big pattern is this proximity increases popularity, right? So I think this stuff's actually really cool. So think about a nice way of testing, Rich was starting to mention this a little bit, but a nice way of testing the role of physical proximity in driving interest is through migrating species, right? Because it's a perfect case study. Like a species is here for part of the year and it's gone for part of the year. So this is a familiar bird. This is the barn swallow. This is citizen science. This is eBird, which is a database some people might be familiar with. So basically, this is the abundance of barn swallows over the course of a year in the northeastern United States. Right. So this is the day of the year. So in winter, there are no barn swallows around. They're all in South America. They arrive in the spring. There are many of them in the landscape over the course of the summer, and then they migrate south, right? This is what the Wikipedia page views look like over that same year. So you can see there's a very strong correlation as barn swallows start to appear in the landscape, as they arrive. Something starts happening where people are looking at them. Are they using Wikipedia to identify birds? Is there just a conversation about barn swallows that starts that leads to this sort of general interest? I don't know. It's an interesting question, right? Here's another species. This is another migratory bird called a chimney swift. You can see chimney swifts arrive in the northeastern US a little bit later than barn swallows, and almost perfectly the timing of their page views correlates with slightly later, right? Yes?
Is this the page views in a certain location, or is this?
This is English language page views. So that's an interesting question though too. So basically, there's enough attention happening in English language in this particular, something's going on that despite the fact that people are looking at Wikipedia in English all around the world, you still see this really strong pattern, right? All right, here's a bird that's present in the United States in winter. This is snowy owls. They breed in the high Arctic. No one really sees them in the summer. They're present in the United States. They travel south in the winter, and you can see we have bigger error margins because there are fewer views overall, but basically you get the inverse pattern, right? I said one of the nice things about Wikipedia is that it has this multilingual aspect to it. So here's barn swallows in Italian. Here's barn swallows in German. You can think of the birds migrating north. And here's barn swallows in Swedish, right? So it's almost as if as they hit each language group, you can see a spike in the views there. All right, third pattern here is that the top species differ between languages. I kind of went into this, I was hoping, I was like, all right, I'm going to get all these different languages and I'm going to find the most famous birds in the world and everybody's going to agree on them, right? Not the case. So if we look at German and Turkish, for example, they're two Wikipedia editions. There's only one species of overlap in the top 10. Otherwise, they're completely different. But we can start thinking about what drives this, and actually part of the answer to this is already, I've already mentioned it, has to do with this feature of proximity, right? So if we look at, so German, you sort of start looking at, well, I don't know if any of you guys are bird watchers, but a lot of these species are ones that occur in Germany. So we'll go back to the survey data. So here we have the frequency of observations. This is birds in Germany, frequency of observations, and then the number of page views in German Wikipedia. And you can see there's a pretty strong pattern. It's not explaining all the variation, but there's definitely a correlation that things that are more frequently seen in German-speaking areas also get more views. And it's actually quite fun to sort of start playing with this type of graph and seeing which species fall out where. Right, so you can sort of start to think about, okay, how are we getting categories of culturalness based on these sort of patterns? So we could say, all right, top right is our common garden birds that people are familiar with, that are popular. Top left are species that are outperforming their encounter rate. So these are species that people don't see very often, but still get a lot of page views. And if you look at them, this is like, it's golden eagle, it's lammergeier, it's eagle owl, so it's, kind of your typical flagship species. So it's large raptors, something called a capercaillie, big grouse, things that people hunt. Here's kind of your little brown jobs. They don't get seen a lot, they don't get viewed a lot. And then these poor guys over here are birds that are actually really common, but nobody really cares about them much, apparently. All right, so you can kind of see that's like, part of the differences might be due to these patterns of geographic overlap. And so then I said, okay, what if we filter out the species that overlap with the language and just look at these, how are the species that occur outside the area of the language performing? So if we go back to this Turkish and German comparison, the top species, so the top species that doesn't occur in Germany is this thing called the budgie bird, people will know this. Top species in Turkey, in the top 10 of the Turkish language ones that doesn't occur in Turkey, is the same bird, right? This little guy. Everybody's going to know this species. It's a common pet, right? So if we expand this across other languages,
sorry about that. I need to click on that one.
we expand this to look across other languages. So what I've done is just use the language edition and then filtered out the species that don't occur, that don't overlap with where that language is commonly spoken, right? We see quite a few budgies, right? We see a lot of dodos. There's a lot of ostriches, peacocks. Other guesses, you can start sort of guessing what these birds are going to be. Emperor penguin, cockatiel, harpy eagle, African gray parrot, right? So if you start looking at the species that somehow have gained a cultural identity beyond their local area of distribution, suddenly we have a kind of common set of species that appears again and again. Canary. So, like I said, I think we're just sort of starting to scratch the surface with some of the patterns here, but I think all of you guys will have some experience and interest in conservation probably, and you can sort of see how some of the data that comes out of this might be quite interesting in terms of the patterns that it's showing, and hopefully I think there are going to be applications to more applied conservation and conservation activities. So these are kind of the four things that I've noticed so far. I'd like to thank my supervisors, my collaborators in my lab who helped me out, and my college funding, and that's it.
I'm just going to finish off now very briefly. Are you still all right? We're not going on a bit long with all of that. Just to talk about another use of these culturomic techniques. And this is some work that John and I are just finishing off at the moment. And again, it's using the Wikipedia corpora. So what we found was that if we want to search sites using these unstructured corpora, it's really difficult to do because the Lake District National Park and the Lake District region, you just can't match them up using a Google search. But Wikipedia, Wikipedia you can. And one thing which is, those of you who know me will know that I'm really interested in the policy histories of protected areas. And one thing which I've always been interested in is this concept of national parks. So if I ask you what a national park is, you might have your own definitions of it, different definitions, or things might immediately come to mind. For me, I've always been a little bit conflicted because one of my definitions of national parks is my definition of what I do in my free time, which is basically go to really amazing places. These wonderful national parks full of spectacular nature and wildlife. But then as a professional, I've worked a lot on actually creating these national parks in places which nobody ever goes to, or tropical countries in Indonesia, Halmahera, and so forth. And the policy history of national park, or the national park concept, is quite clear in a sense. And nicely, it was captured in a very influential little booklet in 1962, which invited leading thinkers in the national park movement to talk about their model of national park. And at that time, there was 5 models of the national park. The first was the American model, where it was about protecting wilderness, spectacular scenery, so that the American peoples could get to know their country better and do visitation and tourism for public enjoyment. The next model was the African model, which was very similar to that, defined in 1933, which said that it's spectacular wildlife, which through practices of engaging the safari, people can get public enjoyment out of that. And then the third version of this one was the Japanese and UK model, which said, well, we haven't got any really spectacular wilderness and we haven't got any amazing wildlife, but we have got beautiful cultural landscapes, so we can promote these for public visitation. This idea is what we might call the national park as a place brand. It's one of the big functions of the national park is identity building, quality of life building, urban, social, rural flows. It's acting as a place brand. This maybe is how many of us see national parks when you go backpacking or when you go on holiday. You say, oh yeah, I'm going to so-and-so, I'm going to go to the national park. Also in this model was a different definition of a national park, the Swiss definition of a national park, which actually says we're creating a place in the nation as a baseline field laboratory against which we can assess environmental change. And then there was the American model, the Australian model of a national park, which actually says what our national parks are is our national portfolio of representative examples of all of the biomes in it. Okay? So these were the 5 models of it. Interestingly, at the 1933 London Convention, they split those 2 models. They called this one a national park and this one a strict nature reserve. Okay? And over time, this one here has got adopted in the IUCN definition. So the IUCN definition, the international definition of a national park, how it's promoted, is this one, but these ones are still living. I was quite interested in how can we think about what this means, how is it distributed. So this is what I'm going to take you through now. So again, as John said, Wikipedia is great for doing this because we can, it's so visited. what we did here was we generated a list of all of the national parks in the world, 3,700, mostly placed on the WPDA, World Database and Protected Areas. But John, how many did we have to add? We had to add quite a lot, didn't we? Anyhow, we had to work with that. And then what we did is we linked every national park name to a page on Wikipedia. Okay? So on Wikipedia, and we know that then we're talking about that particular national park, and then we can use those metrics which John was talking about. And from this we created what we call the Yellowstone Index. So we're just assuming Yellowstone, the first national park, that will be the best known in the world. We'll index the visibility or the interest in the park on Wikipedia against Yellowstone or 100. And we created an index which has two dimensions to it. One is the total number of page views in all languages for that national park, and then there is the evenness of the spread of page views across all the language editions of it. So if we look at that, this is the data on it. When we plot the total number of page views, the total public interest in the park versus the evenness of it, the number of language editions, your national parks of the world fall into this. This side, up there, is your iconic parks, if you like, if you want to call them that, and these are the international ones. And then over this side, we have our iconic parks, but which are more iconic within the nation. So you may see there we've got Jim Corbett National Park, massive in India, which has got a huge internet population, boosted up there, but actually not known about in many language editions. Okay? So this is starting to say, oh, that's interesting. So this category of a national park, which seems to be, in international policy, it's accounted for evenly, there's actually a huge spread there in what this national park entity may look like. And then the next thing we did is actually start looking at the profile of the Yellowstone Index within different countries. And you realise that countries have very different national park policies here in terms of their portfolio of national parks. So here's the first one, the US one. I should say actually this is the Yellowstone Index, so this is the combined index of those two dimensions. And it's a log scale, so if you're up the top, you're really salient compared to if you're in the middle. So you see the US, lots over the 80 mark there. And then we compare it to Australia, that representative model. Huge number of very little known national parks. And then we have the Swiss model of a national park. It is called the Swiss National Park. It only has one on there. And then we're able to, just to see these different models of national park, and then start saying, well, what does that mean? Why is that the case? What is, national park? They're quite a brand, if you like. Are the citizens in these countries aware of it? Anybody just like to guess the top ones in this? See how well you know your national parks. So this is the USA. Top dot is Yellowstone. Tanzania. Top one? Serengeti. Good stuff. Japan. I'm not sure actually. Okay, Swiss have done. Australia. What we've got at the top there? Yeah, Great Barrier Reef. Kakadu. What about this one? This though, Croatia. Look at that top one there. It's not far off Yosemite. Plivik National Park. Okay. Did any of you know about that? A few of you heard of it? Okay. Croatia's really interesting in this. It's got a few national parks, but they're all really well known. South Africa? Yeah. Indonesia. Interesting to see. A lot of parks in the middle, not very salient, but a few really high ones, which are? Komodo. Thank you. We've heard Komodo again. Yeah, amazing that animal. And then Brazil is equal to Vietnam. Massive one. I keep forgetting what Vietnam one's called. Anybody know the Vietnam one? I'll tell you. I can't remember. It's the one after that film Indochine where they go through the bridge. I did write it down. I can never quite remember. Phong Na Kung Beng. I quite like this though. I'm supposed to be a protected area, but these national parks, which are super salient, and we've forgotten the list of iconic. We're not quite sure, even in our own minds, what the list of iconic parks are. The next thing we're doing with this And I'll just show you, these are hot off the press from Simon, who's at the back there, who's produced these for us. So this is a map. This is just a clean plot of the world's national parks on there. You can sort of see the outlines of the countries there. This is the polygon plot on there. So this is the distribution of national parks, not evenly distributed. That might just help you just buffering around, get a sense of them. You can see that Australian park model there. You can sort of see the US one, and then quite a density in this arc up here on Venezuela, Ecuador, and so places, and in the US. So now let's have a look at the Yellowstone Index. Where are these iconic parks listed? So this is the top 100, the above 83 on the Yellowstone Index score. Well, you can sort of see that. I'll just Simon visualises these by buffering. So if we buffer 250 kilometres around them, you can start seeing that there's actually quite a pattern of where these parks are. And something I never realised, that there's an arc of them in Eastern Europe on this. I hadn't realised that this national park as a place brand is really big still in Eastern Europe. And then you've got the arc a little bit along the Rockies in the US. You've got the Indonesian volcanoes. You've got the East Africa there, and a few dotted around. So just to amplify that a little bit, this is the distribution of the world's iconic national parks. Anybody know what this one is here? That one out there, that dot just below Spain? Thank you very much. Looks like we're all going there in 5 work formats time. That's Teide National Park. So just again, that Tenerife National Park. Wow, that is one of the huge national parks of the world. It may be overlooked in that sense. And then this is looking bottom 1200. Sorry, it's supposed to be bottom 200. This is the other side of it. Which are the parks which nobody's heard of, and what's the distribution of those? As you see, it's rather a north-south distribution in this. So a lot of the parks which no one's ever heard about, a lot of them the Australian parks, and then Thailand has sort of adopted the similar model to Australia, and then that arc again in Venezuela and so forth on there. So for me, this is a new way of looking at the world's national parks, and it's sort of starting to tell us something which actually might be quite useful in policy. I think if I was working for a tourism authority, I'd really quite like to know about this. I think if I was working in a government protected area management agency, I might actually like to know that the IUCN model of the national park is actually an Australian model of the national park. And do I want to, or if I'm a politician, do I want to adopt an Australian model, an international model of a national park, or may I want to go to Croatia and Eastern Europe and think about the role of their national parks and how they're using national parks in policy? So the idea here, it's really that it's a way of thinking about these things and looking at it. And again, we were talking about this earlier, about whether these sort of maps, in that sort of reputational risk type use of these, whether this one is telling development where you really shouldn't do your development, and this is telling development where you can go through national parks and you're not going to get a big kickback from the public. In which case, how do we protect those national parks? Great, well I'm going to leave it there, but I hope that's given you a flavour of conservation culturomics. Thanks very much.